What you seen by dog boy? My name is Chulha, and as you could tell from the title, in this video I'm going to be talking about some of the students who graduate from prestigious schools. Now before I get started, I just want to let all you know that I will not be mentioning the name of any school in particular, because first of all, I don't want to get sued, and well, secondly, my aim here is not really to talk about prestigious schools in and of themselves. My aim here is more to highlight a certain mentality which I observed in a lot of my colleagues during my life as a student of a prestigious school. Now initially I thought that this mentality was unique to the students at my school, but then later I came across some students from other prestigious schools and I soon realized that they also have more or less the same mentality. So at this point all you must be wondering exactly what kind of mentality I'm referring to, right? So let me explain. You see, in prestigious schools, so much importance will be placed on academic success that a lot of students just tend to be under the impression that the quality of their character could be gauged simply by how well they perform academically, when in reality, it have many other aspects that does determine the quality of a person's character. Now, because students of prestigious schools just generally perform well in their academics and are generally seen as bright in the eyes of most people, a lot of them just tend to become arrogant and just start to think that they have practically no flaws in their character. This kind of conceited mentality does make it extremely difficult for prestigious school students to realize that they're doing something wrong, despite how well somebody might try to explain to them that they're doing something wrong. Now, I'm not trying to say that all students from prestigious schools have such conceited mentality. You definitely have students from prestigious schools who have good character and who does remain humble despite their academic merit. I'm also not trying to say that academic success don't matter at all. Academic success undoubtedly has its importance because doctors, entrepreneurs, lawyers, etc. all play a crucial role in society nowadays. However, at the same time, getting good grades and earning a big salary are not the only things that make you successful in life, and they are definitely not the only things that make you a good person. I will elaborate on what I mean by that later in the video, but for now let me just briefly try to explain to all you how I decided to structure this video. So I come up with 5 categories which describe the behavior of pathetic prestigious school students, right? But I don't necessarily mean that any particular student could be in only one of the 5 categories. Because if you was to really look at any particular student from a prestigious school, you would usually find that they fall into more than one of the 5 categories. Basically, just think of a Venn diagram with 5 sets in which you would find most students falling into the intersection between several sets, alright? Now I imagine that this would probably turn out to be a fairly long video because I'm going to need some time to properly explain where I'm coming from. With that being said, I highly recommend that you watch this video in its entirety to avoid confusion and don't just jump to conclusions after watching only a portion of the video. So without any further introduction, here are the pathetic products of prestigious secondary schools. Some of the most common traits that you'll notice in a lot of prestigious school students is their arrogance and their narcissism. As a result of this arrogance and narcissism, they always want to prove that they're better than everyone else. And social media is the most useful tool that allows them to do this. Now, if you look at the social media account of a person who's not so narcissistic, you might find them just posting a few pictures from the moments in their life which they cherish the most, according to whatever privileges they have. On the other hand, if you was to look at the social media account of a narcissistic prestigious school student, you would likely find that it does not only post pictures of happy moments in their life, but it is also over exaggerated to make it seem as though them is the happiest people on the planet, and as though them does face almost no problems in life. It's almost as if them think them social media account is a SBA that would be marked based on how happy they make themselves appear. I don't have psychic abilities or anything, but I know for a fact that everybody have problems in life. For some reason though, these narcissistic prestigious school students think that they could fool other people into thinking that they are the happiest people in the world as long as they make their life look as perfect as possible on social media. Now, no matter how successful they might be in making their life look perfect, the fact still remains that neither them nor anyone else have a perfect life. And in all honesty, the extent to which some of them just go just to make their life look perfect to just be utterly ridiculous at times. I mean, it's almost as if the only reason why they would do something exciting or buy something expensive is to just impress other people on social media and to thereby hide the fact that their life is actually far from perfect. You know that we business. You know that we business. Okay, now plenty students who does fall into the first category does tend to fall into the second category as well. Because one thing that you should know about narcissists is that they just desperately seek approval and validation, especially from the people in their social circle. Now, in order to get approval and validation, a lot of these narcissistic students just form cliques in which they just publicly eulogize each other on social media, either through posts or stories. In the case of narcissistic fellows, you would likely find them referring to each other as the GOAT on a regular basis. And in the case of narcissistic girls, you would likely find them referring to each other as Queen or Goddess on a regular basis. Every once in a while, you would also see them tagging all their acquaintances in a post or in a story just to show their followers how quote unquote amazing their acquaintances are. Now, if you was to ask them why they just publicly eulogize each other so much, they would usually claim that they're just being appreciative of their friends. And well, to be fair, it really don't have anything wrong with that. I mean, if you genuinely appreciate somebody, by all means, you should let them know about it. However, you don't have to do it in front of all of your followers. You could easily just DM the person and say what you think of them. You see, the real reason why these narcissists just publicly eulogize their acquaintances is because they want their acquaintances to do the same for them. They essentially just coming together and saying, alright, you stroke my ego in public and I go stroke yours in public so that both of we could feel good and at the same time make ourselves look like nice people, even though we might be terrible people in real life. It's not like any of them genuinely appreciate their acquaintances or anything. It's really just a matter of making each other look and feel good. Now, the reason why I use the word acquaintances instead of friends is because even though these narcissistic students might claim to be friends with each other, they don't genuinely care about the well-being of one another. I mean, real friends would actually care about the well-being of each other and would give constructive criticism from time to time. They wouldn't just flatter each other just to get a ego boost in return. Furthermore, real friends would only compliment and eulogize each other when they find something that they could genuinely be proud of. And in situations like that, the compliments just be a lot more meaningful than the cheap compliments that these fragile flatterers just give each other. Alright, so students who does only fall into the first two categories that I discussed so far are not really that bad because their actions don't directly impact the broader society. On the other hand, the students who are going to be talking about from this point onwards all have a negative impact on the broader society. Now, first and foremost, I'll start by talking about hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals. Basically, a hedonistic pseudo-intellectual is a person who does engage in various kinds of debauchery like drinking, partying, or being promiscuous, and who does then try to demonize anyone who give them even the slightest amount of criticism. I mean, if you was to ever condemn their poor life decisions, they would most likely act as if them totally innocent, and act as if you committed the biggest atrocity by condemning their poor life decisions. In other words, they would essentially try to pose themselves as angels and try to make it seem as if you're the one who doing something wrong. Now I know that some of you might be wondering what exactly is the problem with living a life of debauchery, right? So before I go any further, let me just take a few minutes to explain to all you why it's not very wise to be living a hedonistic life of debauchery. Now, you could definitely have a lot of fun by engaging in debauchery. I'm not gonna deny that. I mean, if you ever went to a party before, you most likely had a lot of fun there. Unfortunately, however, the party must eventually come to an end, and when it does come to an end, you just feel this kind of emptiness inside. Like even though you might have had a blast during the party, when the party done, you just end up feeling as if the party wasn't enough to make you happy, and as if something missing in your life, but you just can't figure out exactly what it is. Now, whenever people just get this feeling of dissatisfaction, they usually don't know how to properly deal with it. And because we live in an age of mass consumerism, people just tend to think that more debauchery would help them in dealing with their dissatisfaction. This notion is far from the truth, however, because in reality, more debauchery will just lead to more dissatisfaction. I mean, even though you might get some pleasure by going to parties every weekend or by purchasing new products as soon as they come out, you would always end up feeling as if something missing in your life. Now, if perpetual dissatisfaction wasn't bad enough, a hedonistic life of debauchery could also lead to depression because many times people just not able to fulfill their desires to engage in debauchery due to circumstances beyond their control. I mean, just look at how the pandemic forced everybody to stay home and to avoid social events like parties and whatnot. Some people get depressed and even suicidal because they just can't imagine what life would be like without attending social events ever so often. Now, somehow you might be watching the video at a point where the government lift the restrictions and where the pandemic is not such a problem anymore. But that's besides the point. The point is that there will always be situations in which you can't engage in debauchery as much as you would like. And during such situations, some people might get depressed because debauchery is the only thing that there's live for. So in light of what I just explained, well, you probably want to know how we're supposed to alleviate the dissatisfaction and depression that does result from excessive debauchery, right? Well, the best way to alleviate dissatisfaction is by pursuing a meaningful and enduring purpose. Now, if you was to ask a young person what their purpose is in life, they would usually say something along the lines of getting rich or getting famous, right? Now, on the surface, those might seem like meaningful purposes, but in reality, when people actually become rich or famous, they just tend to feel even more anxious and dissatisfied than the average person. Because whenever a person has become rich or famous, it does become extremely difficult for them to maintain the status quo. And although they might get some short bursts of happiness from their wealth or their fame, those short bursts of happiness are never enough to give them a true sense of fulfillment. So with that being said, the only way to have a truly meaningful and enduring purpose is to go beyond the materialistic worldview, which most of us have held on to for as long as we could remember. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that the most meaningful and enduring purpose could only be found on the spiritual platform, and according to the various scriptures of the world, that purpose is to essentially love God and selflessly serve God. I know this might sound strange to some people, but in all honesty, it's much more fulfilling to selflessly serve and contribute than to selfishly collect and consume. Some of you might not believe this, but if you was to actually study the scriptures and live a life of selfless service to God under the guidance of a bona fide holy teacher, then your life would become a lot more meaningful and fulfilling. The reason for this is because at the most fundamental level, all of us are souls who are parts of God, and hence we could only be truly satisfied by serving God. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't pursue a career or that you shouldn't have fun. I'm simply advising you to ensure that your career and your recreational activities don't become your primary purpose in life, and ensure that they don't hinder you from pursuing the higher purpose of selflessly serving God. In fact, the best thing would be to try and dovetail your career in the service of God by taking guidance from the scriptures and holy teachers. Now I know that it also have some people who does find it difficult to give up debauchery and to pursue a higher purpose because they might be addicted to certain kinds of debauchery, or they might just be accustomed to using debauchery as a means of coping with emotional trauma, right? So in regards to those people, I would suggest that they continue to pursue a higher purpose, but also try and seek some professional help to recover from their emotional trauma. Because even if you have an addiction, God will help you to recover from it if you sincerely try to work on your relationship with Him. Alright, now I don't want to spend too much time on this topic of spirituality because it is a very deep and complex topic which might take hours to explain in detail. I just wanted to briefly explain the problems that does result from a life of debauchery and suggest a positive alternative before getting into the topic of hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals. Now, you see, the thing about hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals is that they have practically no meaningful purpose in their life, and they feel that as long as they perform fairly well, not exceptionally well, but fairly well in their academics, they could engage in debauchery as much as they want. Now, when they just do things like this, it will obviously have some people who would condemn their behavior, because as students of a prestigious school, they are expected to know better than to just waste all their free time doing frivolous things like drinking, partying, and being promiscuous. The thing is that whenever somebody does actually condemn their behavior, they just get defensive and does accuse the person of personally attacking them. One common way in which they does attempt to defend their behavior is by claiming that their behavior don't affect anyone else and hence shouldn't be called out. This might seem to be a valid argument because, I mean, to be fair, if it's you alone who want to ruin your life, then that is your problem. However, almost 99% of the time, the life decisions of these hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals does affect other people. Because more often than not, students who does fall into this category of hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals does also fall into the first two categories that I discussed earlier. In other words, many of these hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals does like to show off on social media, and whether they realize it or not, their life decisions do have a significant impact on the impressionable minds of students who are younger than them. A lot of them might not realize it, but when they does pedestalize themselves as students of a prestigious school, there will inevitably be people who would look up to them as role models. And when people do look up to them as role models, they have a responsibility to set the right example. Unfortunately, however, most of them think that they have a right to do whatever they want while still pedestalizing themselves as prestigious school students. And for this reason, they just feel personally attacked whenever somebody does condemn what they're doing. In reality, though, they don't have a right to do whatever they want while pedestalizing themselves, because pedestalizing yourself is a privilege, and with that privilege comes the responsibility of being a decent role model at the very least. The sad thing is that most of them just tend to neglect their responsibility as role models, and as a result, they just unwittingly encourage younger students to live hedonistic lives of debauchery. These younger students just then go down a path of perpetual dissatisfaction, which does ultimately end in depression. And some of them does even become hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals within a couple years' time. Now, another thing that some hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals are doing in an attempt to defend their behavior is outright dismissing the idea of living meaningfully and talking as if they're very wise to be living a hedonistic life of debauchery. In other words, they just essentially act as if the main purpose of life is to just seek fleeting experiences from different kinds of debauchery. Because a lot of them really think that if you don't spend your life indulging in debauchery, then you must be living under a rock or something. If you was to ever tell them anything about God or about seeking a higher purpose in life, they would most likely just dismiss you as being old fashioned, because a lot of them just tend to assume that only people in the past used to worship God as a means of coping with life's hardships due to not having as much access to debauchery. This assumption is very far from the truth, however, because even now, a lot of people just make it their life's purpose to worship God, and as a result, they don't become overly disturbed by the hardships of life. While they don't deny the hardships that they face, they also understand that those temporary hardships are trivial in comparison to their eternal spiritual purpose, and hence they don't get disturbed by hardships so much so that they need to turn towards debauchery as a coping mechanism. It is also wrong to assume that people in ancient times were less intelligent just because their technology wasn't as advanced. The reason why a lot of people in ancient times didn't have such advanced technology was because there was focus more on the spiritual aspects of life rather than on the material aspects, and hence, whether you believe it or not, they were a lot happier and a lot more fulfilled than people nowadays. Some might argue that the beliefs of religious people are false since modern science has not been able to prove the existence of God. But the fact that people are actually able to derive deep fulfillment from sincerely worshipping God proves that there is at least some truth to what they believe in, because deep fulfillment is not something that you could derive by simply using your imagination. In spite of all these facts, the hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals continue to proudly engage in debauchery and encourage younger people to do the same, because quite frankly, they don't have any higher purpose in life, and they really think that the best way to move society forward is by allowing people to engage in debauchery as much as possible. The tragedy of it all is that even though they're heading down a path of perpetual dissatisfaction and leading other people down that same path, they really think that they're doing the right thing for themselves and for others. Alright, so by now I think that most are only familiar with the term slacktivist, right? Well, for those who don't know what a slacktivist is, in a nutshell, a slacktivist is basically somebody who does use social media to bring attention to various socio-political issues, but who don't actually care about solving those issues. Now, in my previous rant video, I did touch on the topic of slacktivists, and I basically said that the reason why most of them don't share posts on their story or post up hashtags that bring attention to certain issues is mainly because they want to adopt a mainstream trend or jump on a bandwagon. In regards to prestigious school students, a lot of them does also like to get involved in slacktivism, except that along with jumping on the bandwagon, they just try and make it seem as if they are a lot more concerned about socio-political issues compared to the average slacktivist. Or as people describe it nowadays, they just essentially try to be as woke as possible, and hence I decided to call them pseudo-moralistic slacktivists. Now let me just say for instance that racism is the issue that trended on social media, right? In such a situation, the average slacktivist might just share a generic post saying stop racism and call it a day. A pseudo-moralistic slacktivist on the other hand would try and take things to a whole new level by not only sharing the generic post but also going to a woke page and sharing a whole 10-slide post entitled 5 classic movies with racist undertones or something like that. The worst part about these pseudo-moralistic slacktivists is that people in general just tend to believe that they know what they're talking about, when in reality they usually have no idea what they're talking about. There are many instances that demonstrate this fact, but for the sake of time, I'll just talk about one particular instance that really exposed the pseudo-moralism of these prestigious school students. So I don't know if you all remember this, but back in 2020, there was a lot of uncertainty around how students would write CSEC and CAPE exams at school due to the pandemic, and hence, CXC eventually decided that they would only have multiple choice examinations instead of the standard paper 1 and paper 2 examinations. Now when CXC officially announced that they was going to carry out the exams in such a manner, my colleagues along with many students from other prestigious schools found it to be extremely unfair, because our multiple choice paper can't really do much to truly test out our students' abilities. The funny thing about it is that although there was right for complaining about the way in which CSEC handled the situation, a lot of those very students were also supporting woke ideas like social equality. So with all that being said, according to the woke establishment, it would be better to just have a multiple choice exam instead of a full paper 1 and paper 2 exam, because a multiple choice exam would make it easier for students of all schools to succeed. In other words, because a multiple choice exam would result in more equality, members of the woke establishment would tend to prefer to have that instead of a full paper 1 and paper 2 exam. Basically, the point I'm trying to get at here is that although the pseudo-moralistic slacktivists does publicly show support for a lot of woke ideas, which may sound beneficial in theory, they don't truly believe in the implementation of those ideas, especially when it negatively impacts them. Now, because the mainstream media does promote so many woke ideas and claim that they would benefit society, the pseudo-moralistic slacktivists does publicly show support for such ideas in an attempt to make it seem as if they're trying to improve the condition of society and the world at large. In other words, to put it bluntly, the pseudo-moralistic slacktivist does essentially show support for woke ideas in an attempt to gratify their ego and to feel as if they're solving socio-political issues without actually taking the time to properly analyze the reality of the situation. You see, a lot of these students who does fall into this category of pseudo-moralistic slacktivists does also fall into the previous categories that I spoke about earlier. So with this in mind, if you was to really observe their behavior, you would realize that the only time that they just peddle a media narrative is when doing so does make them look good. And the only time that they just advocate for any kind of social policy is when the social policy makes it more convenient for them to engage in debauchery. Now my question is this. If these people so arrogant and so narcissistic that they only care about their own ego and their own debauchery, then how you could expect them to actually tell you what is right or wrong? The truth is that they really can't, because they would always advocate for whatever helps them in meeting their personal agendas. Furthermore, although these prestigious school students does excel in various areas of study, a lot of them does lack the ability to think critically about things, because the education system nowadays unfortunately teaches students what to think rather than how to think. Like again, take for example the woke idea of social equality, right? Although the idea supposedly intends to make the world a better place by preventing people from abusing their power and eradicating prejudice in society, it unfortunately results in the exact opposite. One of the main problems with this idea is that it's built on the belief that hierarchies always lead to oppression, and that if we was to simply get rid of such hierarchies and put everybody on the same level, then we would have an ideal society. Now, although this might sound like a good idea in theory, a society cannot function without hierarchies, and therefore the question of superiority and inferiority must always arise. In addition to superiority and inferiority, the question of discrimination must also arise, because without discrimination, you cannot determine who is actually qualified to be in a particular position. According to the woke establishment, discrimination is always based solely on prejudice. However, in reality, whenever an employer needs to hire somebody, the employer usually discriminates against the applicant based on their qualifications, namely their knowledge and expertise. The work establishment don't consider any of this, and they just assume that all forms of discrimination are based on prejudice. While prejudice is definitely a problem in today's society, the work establishment does wrongfully assume people to be prejudiced just because they belong to a certain demographic. And whether you realize it or not, that assumption is in itself a form of prejudice. In other words, the woke establishment assumes the members of certain demographics to be oppressed and stereotypes the members of other demographics as oppressive based on things like skin color, race, nationality, etc. There is also envy rich people and has tried to accuse rich people of exploiting the poor just so that their wealth could be redistributed to whoever the woke establishment deems as oppressed. Now, as much as the woke establishment might claim to be helping society by doing all these things, what they're really doing is making people more and more antagonistic towards each other and gradually tearing the fabric of society apart just so that the elites and politicians could meet their selfish agendas. I'm not going to talk about what those agendas are, but what I essentially trying to say is that the woke establishment does use the mainstream media to propagate a lot of twisted ideas like social equality, and the pseudo-moralistic slacktivists does mindlessly advocate for these ideas just to seem like there's the most woke people in the country. If you was to ever say anything that don't align with their narrative, they would scorn you as being ignorant or uneducated, unlike the so-called geniuses that they think themselves to be. Some of them would even try to gaslight you into believing that you should be blamed for the various problems that plague society. So now my advice to all you is this. Do not just blindly rely on these pseudo-moralistic slacktivists to tell you what is right or wrong, and don't be fooled by their pseudo-intellectualism, because although they might be excellent in various areas of study, they will do anything to gratify their ego and to engage in debauchery. Whether it be in regards to the implementation of social policy or in regards to personal choices, the pseudo-moralistic slacktivists will always advocate for things that make them seem woke and for things that make it more convenient for them to engage in debauchery. With that being said, it's obvious that these people don't actually care about the well-being of others or about the betterment of society. Now, to be humbly honest, if we really want to improve the condition of society and the world at large, then we need to again pursue the higher purpose of selflessly serving God, because by doing so, you will strengthen our relationship with Him and would begin to see all beings as souls who are children of God, instead of judging each other by bodily features like skin color. Furthermore, by developing that spiritual vision, we would no longer try to exploit one another, but would instead try to benefit one another. And as crazy as this might sound, the best way to benefit other people is not to redistribute wealth, but to help others to live a more meaningful and fulfilling life by also pursuing the higher purpose of selflessly serving God. In essence, God is like the root of the plant, and everyone else are like leaves and flowers. If you just try to water each leaf of a plant, then the plant will dry up. You need to water the root. Similarly, if we just try to serve people and neglect God, then we can't have peace in society. If most of us was to selflessly serve God as our life's purpose, then we would no longer exploit one another, because we would see each other as members of one spiritual family. We also wouldn't envy one another, but would instead try to cooperate by serving God with the diverse talents and abilities that God Himself has bestowed upon us. Unfortunately, most people nowadays hardly have any faith in God, and hence society is always plagued with problems. Instead of actually solving these problems, the woke establishment does encourage people to adopt pseudo-moralistic stances while leading them further away from God. And the prestigious school students does usually be the first set of people to adopt these stances in an attempt to seem smarter and more compassionate than everyone else. The truth is that no matter how woke these pseudo-moralistic slacktivists try to be, and no matter how much they might eulogize themselves by calling each other the GOAT, they are actually very obedient sheep. Alright, so students who fall into this fifth and final category does basically try to look good around everybody, even if it means that they have to pretend to agree with certain people. In other words, they just essentially try to hide what they truly believe in an attempt to be liked by almost everybody. A common example of a situation in which you might observe this kind of behavior is when these prestigious school students just be around their parents or around elderly people at the church, the mandir or the masjid. In many cases, you'll find them acting completely different from the way in which they would act whilst in the company of their friends or acquaintances at school. While they does act very religious at places of worship and might even be able to quote verses from scripture, it does be a completely different story when you observe the way in which they does behave on social media and around their school friends. Because as usual, a lot of the students who fall into this category does also fall into the category of hedonistic pseudo-intellectuals and into the category of pseudo-moralistic slacktivists. As a result of this, whenever they are not at a place of worship or around their parents, you would find them doing things that are considered immoral in their religious theology, and you would also find them supporting woke ideas that are contrary to the teachings of their religious theology. I'm not going to give any specific examples, but if you properly study the scripture, then you'll know what it considers as moral and immoral. If you was to ever ask them why they does act in such contradictory ways, they does usually claim that they're just being open-minded. Now, to be open-minded really means to understand different people's point of view. It doesn't mean that you just pretend to agree with everyone's point of view. However, these prestigious school students does pretend to agree with everyone's point of view and does then claim that they're just being open-minded. In reality, pretending to agree with everyone's point of view is empty-mindedness and is beyond hypocrisy, because there would inevitably be points of view that contradict one another. The open-minded people pleasers don't care about the fact that they're being hypocritical, because they're only concerned about being liked by almost everyone. As far as religious theology is concerned, Although they might know certain things about their religion, they have a very superficial understanding of it, and they don't really plan on making an effort to deepen their understanding of it. In fact, when they are not at a place of worship, the only time that they just bring up the topic of religion is when they want to persuade a religious person into supporting a woke narrative that goes against the teachings of their religion. The way in which most of them does do this is by saying that God wanted us to be loving and compassionate towards others. Now, although that is true, there's a big difference between what they think it means to be loving and compassionate and what it actually means to be loving and compassionate. According to them, to be loving and compassionate means, in a nutshell, to just allow people to engage in debauchery as much as they want and to even help people in gaining access to debauchery. However, as I have already explained, debauchery does simply result in dissatisfaction and depression. Therefore, to condone and facilitate debauchery in the name of love and compassion is exactly the same as giving a drug addict money to buy more drugs and then claiming that you're just being charitable. If you really want to be compassionate to the drug addict, then the best thing that you could do is to help him to get clean. Similarly, if we really want to be loving and compassionate to other people, then the best thing we could do is to help them to live a more meaningful and fulfilling life by pursuing a higher purpose, instead of helping them to go down a path of perpetual dissatisfaction, which ultimately ends in depression. The real purpose of religion is to help people to live a more meaningful and fulfilling life. It's not meant to help people in living a meaningless materialistic life. Unfortunately, for a long time now, people kept on using religion as a tool to facilitate them in their materialistic pursuits, and they eventually began to forget the true purpose behind religion, which is really to develop our relationship with God. The open-minded people pleasers neither understand nor care to understand any of this, and although they just pretend to be very religious at places of worship in an attempt to impress their parents and other elderly people, God knows what their actual intentions are. Now, to conclude this video, I once again advising all you to not be fooled by the pseudo-intellectualism, the pseudo-moralism, the gaslighting, the so-called open-mindedness, the fake accent, and all the other bullshit tactics that these prestigious school students does use to try and get people to go along with whatever they say. So for this new year of 2022, instead of relying on these prestigious school students to tell us what is right or wrong, let we try to work on our relationship with God and study His words, because in doing so, He will guide us on the right path. I don't know if all you noticed, but in this video I'm not directly talking to these prestigious school students, but rather talking to people in general, because the arrogant mentality that I described in this video so ingrained into the psyche of these prestigious school students that it does be extremely difficult to actually talk sense into them. This video would probably offend a lot of them, but in all honesty, I just stated what I have observed and what I have come to realize. There are many things that I could tell these prestigious school students, but just to summarize it all, I put together a special outro which I will play to end off this video. Now before I play the outro, I just want to humbly request that all you share this video with all your friends if you found what I said to be useful. And also leave a like on this video so that the YouTube algorithm recommends it to more people. Alright, so without further ado, here is my message to the pathetic products of prestigious secondary schools.
This may be hard to hear, since you don't know how to be sincere, like you really care about what people think. And so that's why you lip sync all the talking points and trendy buzzwords. It's dehumanizing, it's so absurd that you think that anybody cares, cause nobody cares, nobody cares about your politics, your taste in music, your regurgitated takes on everything, the clothes you wear or the food you eat. Please shut the fuck up, it means nothing to me. It means nothing to me, it means nothing to me. It means nothing to me, it means nothing to me.
Don't study that.